Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome to another podcast of Journeys of Not So Ordinary People. And I'm one of your co-hosts, Dr. Dave Peltz, and this is our other co-host, Dr. Joe Hamlett. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing fabulous. I'm doing
That's
great.
awesome. Love to hear it. Love to hear it.
Well, good.
So today's topic, like we usually do every week here, following our current trend, is we're going to talk about telling your story, and more deliberately, tell your story. So, Dr. Joe, and following our normal format, what does it mean when I say tell your story, Joe? What does that mean to you?
So at first, it sounds like you're instructing me to do something, and I don't like that. No, the
Ruh-roh.
reality is, we should all tell our story. And the reason I say that, so this happened to me probably 5 or 6 years ago now. But I had a mentor that, during her retirement ceremony, as they were, talking about her accomplishments and things like that, I was amazed at all the things she had accomplished. I really was. And I had known her for quite a few years, but I didn't know a lot of the things that they were talking about, how she was the first this, first that, had to overcome this. And I was just uh, astonished by all those things she had accomplished. And when she went to the stage, she said the exact same thing: tell your story. And that set with me, or that really impacted me, because she put it as, for one, bet you all didn't know all these things about me, which was absolutely true. And a lot of us around the auditorium or the stage were looking and like, wow, we didn't know that. And the other thing she said was that you tell your story because you never know what people are going through, or you never know how you might positively impact them. Because a lot of times we think we're the only ones experiencing certain things. So we think, in terms of being in a vacuum, it's just us. But the
Mhm.
reality is, a lot of us are going through very similar things, or, it may be some of the exact same thing. So us telling our story, for one, may invite somebody into maybe to think it's not just them.
Mhm.
The other part of it is, even if it's, 1,000 people in a room and you're telling your story, even if only one person walks away with some positive impact on their lives, then it's a success, you telling your story.
Yeah,
I was also in a
absolutely.
conversation just a couple of weeks ago with a gentleman. I was telling my story. We were just really chatting after an event. And, he finally said to me, "Man, you should be telling your story." And that's the truth. Again, because we take it for granted, or, we don't know the impact it's going to have on other people until they hear it. So
Yeah,
that's what I've been trying to do for the past few years, at least 5 years now, just to tell our story. So,
yeah. Yeah, that's a great intro, Joe. I like this topic a lot because you and I do a lot of storytelling. Our
yep,
podcast is just about that. It's telling our story. It's
right,
telling the story of Dave. It's telling the story of Joe, and it's telling the story of the two of us, and some of the podcasts and how we met and how we've interacted over the past several years. And it's interesting to understand our unique stories, and it's also even more interesting to understand the commonalities between Joe and I. It's quite amazing to understand that about us as individuals, us as partners, us as educators, us as professionals and experts in our perspective fields. So to to build upon that, it's really important for us to not just tell our stories to each other, but to everyone, because
right,
to Joe's point, you never know who you're going to help. It's
yep,
similar to the adage of, be polite to everyone and say hello, because that might be the one thing that changes their mind and helps them have a better day.
right,
So, and that's where Joe and I are coming from when we share our stories. It's to um, help others not to have to go through the long scenic route, the long painful scenic route that Joe and I have taken throughout our career. And, the same applies to all of our listeners and viewers. You all have your own unique stories. Please share them, because the one thing that Joe and I that don't want to see, or don't want to see very often, if it can be avoided, is for other people to have to take the long, painful scenic route or reinvent the wheel. We're here to help you, you know, better yourselves and to shorten that learning curve. And if you want to take the long scenic route, then it becomes a choice
Right.
versus,
Right.
you know, that's the only path that you have. You don't have any options. So, um, yeah, one of the things that I do is, you know, I do transition training for the military, for individuals who are getting out of the military and becoming civilians, or becoming civilians again. What does the normal job market look like versus being in the military? And, you know, a big part of that is telling my story. And, it's not all of it is peaches and roses. Some of it's, not very fun to hear, but it's the reality of it. And the good things make us who we are. And I believe that the challenging events also help make us who we are, even more so, because that's where we really learn those valuable lessons, and to share those opportunities with others. We go back even to when we were all adolescents. I believe all of us were adolescents. We haven't been cloned yet. You know, we learned, the first people we learned from were our parents or our family
Right.
members.
Yep.
And from there, we listened to their stories. And so we didn't have to reinvent the wheel, or hopefully not reinvent it too many times like I had to. Little stubbornness runs through this thing up here. So yeah, so that's why we do this, and why it's important to tell stories, because we want to share these things. And you all have your own unique stories. Again,
Right.
I feel like I'm talking in circles now, but it's really what the point is, by sharing these things. And I'm going to backtrack a little bit. Part of my story is, and Joe's story is, neither one of us grew up rich. We both grew up poor. We weren't the best students in school, high school, that is. We both went into the military either after high school or shortly thereafter. We both started college later in our lives,
Right.
30, 29, 30 plus years of age. So we were definitely in that adult learning category. We both got our doctorates. We both are
Right.
published authors. We both taught college. We're both podcasters. Coincidence? I don't know. We both wear glasses. We both have dark hair, or had dark hair.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I
so
don't know
we
about
both
that one.
dress well. So all these coincidences. So, yeah. So Joe, what would you like to add to this? I mean, we've kind of both thrown our beginnings out there. What would you like to add?
So, I want to go back to, like as a kid, our parents tell us all these things and to watch out for, and things like that. So that's really an extension of what we're doing today, is
Mhm.
they were trying to share their experiences and what they knew life to be, so that we may, that we didn't go through those difficult times like they did. A lot of times, like you said, we had that hard headedness that sometimes it didn't soak in the first time, and we still had to bump our head against the wall. So I really think about telling your story, or the reason for telling your story is to get others prepared.
Mhm.
And that preparedness piece, that again, if somebody would have helped me along the way with some of these things, and Dave said it too, that we would maybe not had to go through those tough and difficult times. Um, but he also mentioned, we went to school later in life and some of those different things. So by me and Dave telling our story, we may help somebody who's thinking, I'm too old to go back to school, or I could
Mhm.
never do that. But me and him being an example of, going back to school later in life and earning a doctorate degree. Um, I didn't have anybody as an example,
Yeah.
for me to look up to and to say, hey, that guy did it, or that girl did it. I could probably do it. So, us telling our story, like I say, may help you to realize that you can do these things as well. So I think that's a huge part of it, is just sharing those experiences with other people, so that even if they just take it and set it aside, at least they have another piece of information that they can relate to when they're making decisions on their life, because they may hear it go in one ear and out the other, but at least they have that in their, in their memory banks that they can reflect on if down the road they need to. Because there's a lot of things that, people told me as 40 years ago that I can still remember that are relevant now. So
Mhm.
I think that's the biggest thing, and that's why I think adult learning or just lifelong learning is so important. Is that you have something to compare to, you have something to glean from when you're thinking about what's next for you,
Mhm.
what's next in your life. So for us to all tell our story to other people, it may seem like it's on, falling on deaf ears at first, but the reality is that people probably have stored some of that in the back of their memory and probably can recall it down the road. So again, telling our story is because we don't know how we might impact somebody. I think that's the most important thing. Even if
Yeah.
people are rolling their eyes if you're telling your story sometime, I guarantee you they're going to walk away with something they didn't even realize, or they're going to
Yeah.
recall that later
If they're
in
paying
life.
attention, and
It,
this
right?
gets back
Yeah.
to some of our other podcasts where, you have to make a conscious choice to pay attention. You have to make a
Right.
conscious choice to go out every day and say, I will learn something new, even if it's this big. It doesn't have to be
Right.
life changing. It could just be, maybe it's a new website, maybe it's a new, you know, new food or a new dish, whatever. It,
Right.
it could be
Right.
anything, a new song, a new show, a new sport, new anything. So
Right.
it doesn't just have to be one way. It doesn't have to be something big. It can be anything, and it can be
Right.
personal, it can be professional, it can just be day-to-day stuff. Maybe that's personal. So,
Right.
but it's really just starts with making that effort of putting yourself
Right.
out there, and it does mean making yourself vulnerable, and
Right.
and that's a big reason why people don't share a lot of things, is because it's uncomfortable or they don't want to be judged. And
Right.
I'm the last person to judge someone.
Right.
So, I look at it this way. If people are going to judge me, that's their choice, because people will judge.
Right. Absolutely.
So we can't please everyone. Again, a lot of these adages, colloquialisms and whatever, but a lot of these things still hold true, and they hold true for a reason. So, just because it's not on education or work topic or whatever, doesn't mean you can't share something and tell your story. And
Right.
that's really how Joe and I got started. And Joe, we've been doing this for many years, and a lot of it has been just to help other people. And it started with me, getting out of the military 3 times and going through that struggle, and finally realizing, hey, I need to stop holding these lessons to myself and start helping others with it, with
Right.
the things that we know, whether it's through our professional development, whether it's through our, college development, whether it's through our military, whatever, life development. These things need to be shared. And it started out for me, I started sharing when I started, doing college enrollment and understanding the importance of college and education and certifications and vocational education, not just, higher ed. There's all kinds of education that's out there. And it really boils down to helping people understand the value through our own stories. And they
Right.
might not want to buy what we have to say, but at least they listen, and maybe they can't use it, but maybe someone that they know, or someone that they know who knows someone who knows someone, can use this
Right. Right.
information. And that's really what it's about. And that trails off into networking, or your network, or those, paying attention to those around you. So it really does broach many different areas of our life when we talk about storytelling, and and the importance of it, because from a societal perspective, the United States is a very individualistic culture, and there are other cultures around the world that are more collective, more into,
Right.
it takes a village versus I'm just out for me. And there are pros and cons to both sides of those things, and I believe that there are times when both, one or the other, and or both, are needed. So when we start talking again, focusing on telling our stories, what is the goal of this? And it's really to help others learn from our lessons. And we all have learned lessons, don't touch the hot stove, it's going to burn.
Right.
Sure it is. Psst. Oh, maybe I need to listen a little bit more. There's a lesson. The other lesson is don't touch things that are hot. Right.
Right.
So, what are
Well,
your thoughts?
I want to go back to, you talked about the fact that maybe you tell your story and it doesn't directly affect somebody that's listening, but they may, pass it on to someone else. And that has occurred to me so many times. I'll be doing something and somebody will reach out to me and say, "Hey, I told this person about you. They want to hear a little bit more," because again, that individual may not relate to me, but the other one that they referred can, or they may be going through similar experiences, and hearing my story, spark something in them to pass it on to someone else. So, again, that direct audience may not benefit from what you're talking about, but somebody else can. So I think that's very important too.
Mhm.
That, like I say, even if there's a room of 1,000 people and only one person gets something out of your story, then it's still worth it.
Yeah.
So I just, that reminded me the importance of, again, telling your story to people, that it doesn't just stop there in a lot of cases. It
Yeah.
expands and extends beyond whatever group you're talking to. And again, I just can't tell you how many times people have reached out to me because somebody else has referred them to me.
Right.
And, when I went back to school, that was probably the biggest example. I had these direct people that I was talking to all the time. Hey, go back to school. It's never too late. And it was just funny that a lot of those people that I was talking to directly, they didn't, take advantage of that, but people around them did,
Mhm.
which even some of their, relatives and really close friends, because even though they didn't benefit from it or to take advantage of it, they were still um, listening well enough to hear those things were important to somebody that they knew. So that, I always think that's very cool, that it may not be a direct link, that you're helping somebody, but those references and referrals around that is still pretty positive. So I just
Yeah.
wanted to kind of touch on that.
And I like where you're going with this, Joe, because some viewers and listeners might be thinking, and admittedly, this is where I fell many years ago. Is like, well, if I tell my story and the person doesn't listen or learn from it, what's the real purpose behind
Right.
telling your story? Because it's falling upon, people just aren't listening or paying attention, and that's
Right.
okay. One, it's helping you perfect your story or polish your story. Two, it's helping you learn different audiences and, the types of individuals or audiences that will appreciate it and not appreciate it.
Right.
And three, if you can touch just one person's life one time,
Yep.
that's huge. Now think about it this way, from this perspective. If you're telling your story 1,000 times throughout your life and only one person, and each time you tell that story out of 1 to 1,000 people, every time you tell that story, that's 1,000 people you've affected.
Absolutely.
So just
Absolutely.
because you tell the story to one person, your story to one person, doesn't mean, or 10 people, and they don't get it or don't get anything away from it, doesn't mean that the next time you tell your story, one or more or everyone's not going to get it.
Right.
So
Right. No, and into that, to your point, though, think about this again. Even if you tell your story and it doesn't directly affect somebody that you're in your audience, they go back and tell somebody, and
yeah.
then that passes on. I remember when I went back to school originally, um, in 2005, I had a friend. We had deployed several times, and we were actually deployed this time. He found out I was going back. I went back to school, so he went back to school. That in turn got his wife to go back to
Mhm.
school, and then the next time I saw him, he said his one of his kids were going to school, and it
Yeah,
all started with that initial telling my
that's
story to my
powerful.
friend, and
Mhm.
then it exploded into his entire household. So,
Mhm.
so like you said, even if it affects one person, how many people beyond that will it affect? And
Right.
so that's the power of storytelling is again sharing those things that in your eyes even it may seem insignificant. It may not seem like a big deal, but in somebody else's eyes, it could be huge to them. So that's why I tell my story every chance I get. Sometimes I can tell that, especially like in a small room, and I've told my story to someone across the room, and then I move across the room and tell it again, and I can see some of those same people around me, like I just heard that story. But
Mhm.
it's still, to me, it's still important to tell it again if somebody
Yeah.
asks, and so
Yeah, and, how many times have you and I told our story, Joe, to individuals about
right,
starting school late
right,
or going into the military or, working in different work environments or not working in certain work environments because we've
right,
had
right,
the opportunity to be affected by,
right,
reorganizations or, layoffs or what have you. So all these stories matter, whether it's personal or professional. And, professionally, speaking, I love to tell my story. Personally, my family's tired of hearing me tell my story. So too bad they're going to hear it a million more
right,
times. But, when we tell our stories, it's important to understand that we each have our own story, and that
right,
life story is comprised of many, many smaller stories, those
right,
events that we can really share, those learning moments, if you will, or teaching moments, as they're sometimes referred to, and they don't have to be long and drawn out. They can just be a couple of moments, but they can be very impactful.
right,
And, whether it's in the professional work environment as a trainer or educator, or just a peer, a colleague, a supervisor or subordinate, a leadership role, manager role, line
right,
staff, it doesn't matter. Many of the stories, and I would argue most of our stories, are universal at their core.
right,
It's just finding the people to listen to, or just taking the opportunity to tell your story and not being afraid or embarrassed or ashamed, because we can't change our past. We are who we are because of our
right,
past. The only thing we can do is change the present and the future. So the best way to do that is to learn from others. That's why we go to school, to learn
yep,
about engineering, instead of, you know, coming up with a stick and some dirt and start drawing out mathematical equations to understand it. We go to someone else to learn these things. So we do this all the time. We hear their stories. It's just, are we really paying attention to those stories? And in a formalized environment, we make choices as adults.
right,
Hey, I'm going to take this training, or I have to go to this training because I'm required to. What am I gleaning from this? Maybe it's what I should do, or maybe it's what I shouldn't do. Maybe it's a better way to do something or a way to not do something.
right,
So there are plenty of opportunities to share your stories about many different facets. I've said many times that throughout our podcast, I like DIY stuff. I like to do tile,
right,
not so much anymore. The body's getting older, but I love tile. I love to do projects. I love to stay busy. How do you do that? Well, that's an opportunity. How do you do a podcast? How do you mentor? How do you coach? How do you do all the long list of podcasts that Joe and I have talked about? Those are all learning moments. Those are all stories. And some of them are fun, some of them are not so fun, some of them are funny under certain lights.
right,
Sometimes our sense of humor is much different than other people's sense of humor. So
right.
it just depends.
So I think about I think you touched on it, but the professional setting. I mean, and you mentioned this earlier too about reinventing the wheel. I mean, how many times have you been in a meeting and you rehash the same thing over and over again
Mhm.
because nobody was paying attention at the previous 3 or 4 meetings? So that is one example where if we really listen to the problems and the issues that they had in the previous iteration of whatever was going on, then you probably could resolve a lot of those things by applying different methods instead of doing it over and over again. So
Mhm.
when I talk about lifelong learning, that's really what I'm talking about too. Is even sitting in a setting, um, even if it's finding out information that I may never use, but it may be
Yeah.
helpful down the road when I say, well, they tried that, or I remember they said that and that didn't work, so I'm going to try a different approach. So it's all about, and you said this earlier too, about gleaning the information that and we say this all the time on our podcast, that's going to help you, because again, you can get a plethora of information and knowledge, but if it doesn't apply to you, or if you don't know how to use it that's going to best suit you, then it's just a bunch of noise. So it
Mhm.
still comes down to, regardless of what story you hear, what parts are going to work best for you, or what are parts that are applicable to your situation. And I think that's what it's still all about.
Mhm.
Even when you hear people tell their stories, it's, what can I take from that and use that in a positive light, or use it to help me, maybe prevent me from doing those other things. And that's why, again, we talk about Journeys of Not So Ordinary People podcast. It's really just that, me and Dave on here telling a bunch of stories, you know, between each other, the two of us. And just like everything, I've learned stuff from Dave that didn't know, because, he's divulged a little bit more of his story, and I've, divulged a little bit
Yep.
about
And same
myself
here.
too.
Yeah.
So it's just, again, even though we've known each other for a lot of years and we have a lot of conversations, there's still stuff that I'm learning about him. And like you said, still stuff he's learning about me, just because, depending on the situation, what part of the story is going to come out, or more details about a certain story that come out. And that's really where 2 weeks ago, like I said, I was talking to this gentleman that I work with, and every time I told him something, he said, "Man, why didn't I know that?" Or, "You should tell more people." And it just, he said, "Talking to you is like peeling back an onion."
Mhm.
And it really was, because we just kept talking, and I kept telling my story. And again, the more and more he heard and learned, the more informed he was, and the more excited he was about hearing more. So, you know, not everyone, Dave said it, not everyone's going to want to hear your story, or they're going to not pay attention to it. But again, if we can get just that one person to hear our story, and maybe prevent them from taking a long scenic route, or
Yeah.
running into issues or problems, just like, he touched on touching the hot stove. How many times you have touched the hot stove? But just imagine that first
A
person that
lot,
touched,
actually.
well, imagine that first person that touched the hot stove and nobody told them.
Yeah.
It's like, "Oh,
Right.
crap, that's hot." And
Don't
so what,
don't jump in that pond. It's full of piranhas.
right. So yeah, just again, it doesn't have to be this long drawn out story, but anything that can assist someone else in their journey, or what they're trying to accomplish, I think that's very important. And one of the things I even tell people, when they ask for advice for interviews, that's the one thing I tell them to do, is get
Yep.
really good at telling your story.
Yep.
Because once you
Absolutely.
get that down, you get comfortable with it, then when they start asking you other questions, you're at a comfort level,
Yeah.
because you just talked about yourself, the
Yeah.
the thing you should know most about you. And
Yep.
so I think that's a way to, again, help you, relax, calm yourself, especially, and a lot of times people don't like to brag about themselves, and
Mhm.
not necessarily that, but just talking about you, in a positive light, or sometimes it might not be in a positive light, but just talking about yourself, telling your story. Like I say, the biggest thing is, you don't know how many people you're going to impact, or who you're going to help with your story. So, uh, I continue to tell my story, and I encourage you all to tell your story as well.
Yeah. Yep. And as we wind down, I'll just throw a couple more things out there. The nice thing about storytelling, or I shouldn't say the nice thing, it is a nice thing, but just remember, when you tell your story, the difference between telling someone to do something versus telling your story is, telling someone, you just tell them, hey, go do that, or go do this.
Right.
When you tell your story, you're talking about the what, the how, and the why, and your
Yeah.
lessons learned. And you can tell your story, or different smaller stories, from different perspectives, and it can be the same story, just from a different lens or a different approach. You can, in the professional environment, you can take the same story and tell it from a leadership perspective, a supervisory perspective, a line staff
Right.
perspective, a safety perspective, helping others, whatever. You can tell the same story from multiple different perspectives. So I'm glad that you brought that up. Any final thoughts before we close out this episode, Dr. Joe?
Well, we've been saying it this whole time. Tell your story.
Tell your
And
story.
I am telling you to tell your story. It's very
Right.
important. Like I say, talked to a lot of people over the years, especially in recent years, and that is what I encourage them to do is to tell their story because Dave said it earlier. We're all unique. We all have unique stories, and I just when people's eyes light up because they can relate to the story, and I'll just
Mhm.
briefly go back to that part. When you tell your story, you let people in, and
Yeah.
become vulnerable, but that's what people want to know. A lot of
Yeah.
times people, when they hear Dr. Hamlet or Chief Hamlet, they're hesitant because they hear are the titles, all they see is me at
Yeah.
this level. But after I tell them the story of how I got here, then they can relate to that
Yeah.
because they a lot of those things mirror what they would happen in their lives, or they know someone. So it's about humanizing yourself to other people to let them know that again you're just like them. So I think that's the other side of telling you in a lot of ways like them. So
Yeah. Yep. All right. Well, with that being said, I think that's a wonderful way to close things out. Would like to thank our listeners and viewers for tuning into another episode of Journeys of Not So Ordinary People podcast. Again, if you like what you're hearing, please give us a like and share our links with those that you know. If it doesn't affect you, doesn't mean it might not affect someone else. Again, storytelling at its best. And with that, keep on being your not so ordinary you.